the Bible. People call it the foundation of morality, the Word of God, the ultimate guide to living a righteous life. But here's the part they don't talk about. Buried in those same pages are laws so strange, so petty, and so ridiculous. No preacher dares to read them out loud on a Sunday morning. Don't eat shrimp, but grasshoppers are fine. Don't wear clothes made from two fabrics, or you're guilty of sin. And if your rebellious teenager talks back, the punishment isn't grounding, it's death by stoning. Sounds unbelievable, right? But it's all there, in the so-called divine rulebook. Now, let me ask you, if these really came from a perfect, all-knowing God, why do they read more like the superstitions of an Iron Age tribe? And here's the bigger question. If believers know these laws exist, why do they quietly ignore them? That's the tension we're about to explore. Because these aren't just quirky relics. They reveal something deeper. The Bible's laws were never timeless wisdom. They were survival rules written by people in a specific time and place. And when you see them for what they really are, the authority of the text starts to crumble. But don't take my word for it. In the next few minutes, we're going to walk through some of the strangest, most absurd, and yes, most dangerous laws in the Bible. Some will make you laugh out loud. Others will make you wonder how anyone ever called this a moral code. And by the end, you'll see why modern believers avoid these passages at all costs. Because once they're spoken out loud, the illusion of divine wisdom disappears. So let's start where the absurdity begins. With food. Apparently, your dinner plate was once a matter of heaven or hell. Food laws that make no sense. Let's talk about food. Because according to the Bible, what you put in your mouth could make you holy or disgusting. In Leviticus, you're told not to eat shellfish. Shrimp, lobster, scallops, all off limits. Pork, also banned. And here's the kicker. The rule is that animals must both chew the cud and have split hooves to be considered clean, which means cows are fine. But pigs? Nope. Meanwhile, locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers, those are fair game. So the God who supposedly created the oceans filled with delicious seafood decided lobsters are an abomination, but crunchy insects are a divine snack? Fast forward to today and look around. Millions of people eat shrimp cocktails, bacon cheeseburgers, and pork ribs without a second thought. And guess what? They're just fine. No fire from heaven. No plagues. No divine punishment. Just dinner. So why were these laws there in the first place? Maybe they had practical roots, parasites in pork, or lack of refrigeration in ancient times. Sure. But here's the problem. If the laws were just ancient health guidelines, why call them eternal commands from a perfect God? Why brand shrimp as morally evil instead of just unsafe in that era? That's the real absurdity. By elevating these survival rules into holy law, religion created guilt and fear where none was needed. And to this day, some believers still cling to these food taboos, as if God really cares whether you're eating calamari or kale. But food laws are just the appetizer. The Bible doesn't stop at your dinner plate, it zooms in on your closet. Because apparently, the fabric you wear on your back was also a matter of eternal purity. Clothes and fabric rules. Now, let's step out of the kitchen and into your closet. Because according to the Bible, your wardrobe might be a sin factory. Leviticus lays it out clearly. Do not wear clothing woven of two different kinds of material. Wool and linen together? Forbidden. That comfy cotton, polyester hoodie you're probably wearing right now? Technically, you're breaking God's law. Let's pause here. Think about it. The supposed creator of galaxies, black holes, and the DNA double helix is deeply concerned about the thread count of your socks? That's not divine wisdom. That's micromanagement at the level of a cranky hall monitor. And it doesn't stop at fabric blends. The Bible also has rules about trimming beards and cutting hair. Men are told not to shave the edges of their beards. To this day, some groups take it literally, walking around with facial hair shaped by a 3,000-year-old purity code. But here's the bigger question. Why? What purpose does this serve? Ancient purity rituals? Maybe. Cultural identity markers? Probably. But here's the catch. If these were truly eternal, universal laws, why doesn't any preacher stand up on Sunday and say, "Brothers and sisters, cast off your polyester blends and repent"? They don't. Because deep down, even believers know these rules are indefensible in a modern world, so they ignore them, selectively, which raises a serious problem. If God's perfect law can just be skipped over when inconvenient, was it ever really divine? That's the tension religious communities don't want to admit, and it's about to get worse. Because after telling you what to eat and what to wear, the Bible moves on to something even stranger: how to run your farm. Yes, apparently, God also had strong feelings about seeds, donkeys, and vineyards. Micromanaging daily life. If the food laws and fashion police weren't enough, the Bible goes full-on bureaucrat when it comes to everyday life. Deuteronomy commands that you must not plant 2 different kinds of seeds in the same vineyard. Sounds more like a picky gardener than an all-powerful deity. Imagine being dragged before the elders for mixing tomatoes and cucumbers. Divine crime. And it doesn't stop there. Another law forbids plowing a field with both an ox and a donkey yoked together. Why? Because apparently, God has a very strong opinion about your farm equipment. The almighty creator of the cosmos is keeping tabs on crop rotation and animal pairings. Put these side by side with the beard rules. Don't trim the edges, don't round them off, and the picture becomes clearer. These laws aren't about morality, they're about micromanaging. About making sure every part of life, from your field to your face, stayed under strict control. But here's the real kicker. While these bizarre little details were policed, bigger issues like fairness, justice, or compassion often took a back seat. A man could own slaves without breaking divine law, but woe to anyone who dared plant wheat and barley together. It's almost comical. And yet, this kind of micromanagement had a very real purpose. It kept people constantly aware of the rules, constantly anxious about breaking them, constantly in need of the priests who controlled forgiveness. It wasn't morality, it was surveillance. And when you look at it that way, the absurdity becomes dangerous. Because if people can be made to obey laws that make no sense, then obedience itself becomes the highest virtue. But what happens when those laws go beyond quirky and cross into barbaric? Because the Bible doesn't just nitpick your seeds and beard hairs. It also prescribes punishments so extreme, so violent, they make you wonder how this was ever considered holy. From quirky to cruel, violence in the name of purity. Up until now, the laws we've looked at seem quirky, even laughable. Don't wear mixed fabrics. Don't plant 2 seeds together. Don't eat shrimp. Strange, sure, but not terrifying. But here's where the Bible takes a dark turn. Because woven into these pages are laws that don't just micromanage life, they sanction violence. Take Deuteronomy's rule for brides. If a woman was not a virgin on her wedding night, the punishment was public execution, stoned to death at her father's doorstep. Not only is this barbaric, it reveals what these laws were really about: controlling women, guarding male honor, and using fear to enforce purity. Or consider the man in the book of Numbers who was caught gathering firewood on the Sabbath. What happened to him? He was executed. For picking up sticks. Imagine that. A God who allegedly created the stars and galaxies, ordering death over yard work on the wrong day of the week. This isn't morality, it's cruelty dressed up as law. It's not about protecting people from harm, it's about protecting authority, keeping everyone terrified of stepping out of line. And the contradictions scream out: murder, sometimes overlooked; slavery, allowed. But gather wood on the Sabbath or fail a virginity test, and the penalty is death. What kind of moral system prioritizes these things? This is where the illusion of divine wisdom starts to collapse. Because once you see that violence was baked into the system, often in the most trivial ways, you can't unsee it. And yet, these weren't the only laws that blurred morality with superstition. Some didn't kill you outright, but they branded you as unclean. They dictated how women lived, how people interacted, and who was considered worthy. Which raises the next question: what happens when entire communities are shamed and isolated, not for crimes, but for being human? Laws that humiliate women. If you really want to see how these so-called divine laws were stacked, look at how women were treated. Because the Bible doesn't just micromanage daily life, it outright humiliates half the population. Start with menstruation. In Leviticus, a woman on her period is labeled unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touches her is also unclean. Anything she sits on or lies on, unclean too. Imagine the isolation. Imagine the stigma. A natural, healthy part of biology turned into a spiritual curse. And the echoes of that stigma still linger in cultures today. Then there's the infamous adultery test. In Numbers, if a husband suspected his wife of cheating, the priest would make her drink a mixture of water and temple dust. If she got sick, she was guilty. If not, she was innocent. Sounds less like divine justice and more like a magic potion lie detector test. Notice, too, that there was no equivalent ritual for men. Only women were put through this degrading spectacle. And behind it all was the obsession with female purity. A woman's worth was tied to her virginity, her obedience, her cleanliness. Men could stray and be excused, but women's bodies were policed, shamed, and punished. These laws weren't about morality. They were about control. Control of reproduction, control of family lines, and control of women's lives. And here's the brutal truth. When you elevate humiliation into holy law, you create generations of women who learn to see themselves as lesser, as impure, as guilty simply for being human. But the Bible's laws didn't stop with women. They spread the same fear and absurdity into every corner of life, branding people as guilty for things they couldn't control, turning private struggles into public condemnation. Which brings us to the next chapter, how guilt itself became the sharpest weapon of all. The truly bizarre ones. Some Bible laws are cruel, others are controlling, but then you stumble on the ones so bizarre, you can't help but laugh, until you remember people once treated them as holy. Take this gem from Deuteronomy. If two men are fighting, and the wife of one grabs the other man's genitals to defend her husband, her hand must be cut off. No mercy, no exceptions. That's the actual text. Imagine carving that into stone tablets and calling it moral law. Or look at the rules about oxen. If your ox gores someone to death, the ox must be stoned. But if the ox was known to be dangerous and you didn't pen it in, then not only is the ox killed, you might be executed too, unless you pay a ransom. It reads like a strange mix of animal control law and ancient insurance policy, except stamped with divine authority. And then there's the toilet law. In Deuteronomy 23, the Israelites are commanded to have a designated place outside the camp to relieve themselves and to carry a stick to cover it up. On one hand, yes, that's basic sanitation. On the other hand, this is supposedly the creator of galaxies handing down camping tips about latrines. Really? The same being who designed the stars and the Milky Way is also micromanaging bathroom breaks? These oddities reveal something crucial. These weren't eternal, universal principles. They were the everyday survival codes of an ancient tribe. But once wrapped in religious language, even the most mundane details were treated as sacred. And here's the problem. When you give divine weight to human rules, you can justify almost anything, even the ridiculous, even the cruel. But not all of these laws stayed harmless quirks. Some were weaponized. Some justified slavery. Others fueled witch hunts and persecution. And that's where the bizarre turns truly dangerous. Slavery and human property. If there's one set of laws that shatters the idea of the Bible as a moral guide, it's the ones about slavery. Because buried in those pages are rules that treat human beings, not as children of God, but as property. Exodus 21 lays it out plainly. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she doesn't get the same rights as male servants. She isn't freed in the same way. She is property to be traded. Think about that. A divine law allowing a father to sell his own child. Leviticus adds another chilling detail. Hebrew slaves could eventually be released after a set number of years, but foreign slaves? They could be owned permanently, passed down to your children as an inheritance, just like livestock. That wasn't just tolerated, it was codified in holy law. And notice the double standard. Rest on the wrong day? Death. Plant two seeds together? Sin. But owning another human being? Allowed, regulated, endorsed. If these laws came from a perfect, just God, why do they sound exactly like the rules of a patriarchal society protecting its power? Some believers try to soften this by saying slavery back then wasn't like slavery today. But read the text. The system was still one where people, especially women and foreigners, were stripped of dignity, treated as property, and denied freedom. That's not morality, that's control. And history proves it. These very passages were used for centuries to justify the transatlantic slave trade, to defend segregation, and to silence calls for equality. The Bible wasn't ahead of its time. It was behind, and clung to long after humanity should have moved on. Which raises a haunting question. If the book condoned slavery, what else was called divine law that was never moral at all? Because slavery wasn't the only outdated command. Some laws fueled witch hunts, violence, and persecution for centuries, and those consequences weren't laughable, they were deadly. Selective memory. Why believers cherry pick. Here's the part that really exposes the game. Believers don't follow all these laws, not even close. When was the last time you heard a sermon about mixed fabrics, or saw a pastor warning their flock about the dangers of shrimp cocktail? You haven't, because everyone knows those rules are ridiculous. They've quietly been pushed aside, filed under, that doesn't apply anymore. But here's the strange part. The very same people will dig into the Bible's laws when it comes to sexuality or gender roles. They'll preach about biblical marriage, quote, verses against same-sex relationships, or use purity laws to shame women. Shrimp? Forget it. Polyester blends? Who cares? But when it comes to controlling people's private lives, suddenly the ancient rules are treated as eternal truth. That's not morality, that's cherry-picking. And the inconsistency screams human invention. Because if these laws were really divine, wouldn't they all matter equally? Wouldn't every word stand the test of time? Instead, what we see is a selective memory game. Keep the parts that reinforce power, ignore the ones that make the faith look absurd. And deep down, everyone knows it. That's why you'll hear phrases like, well, those laws were for a different time, or that doesn't apply anymore. But if God's perfect law can expire like spoiled milk, was it ever perfect? Or was it just a collection of cultural survival rules dressed up as divine commands? This is where the cracks in the foundation become impossible to ignore. Because the moment you admit the Bible's laws are inconsistent, you open the door to the bigger realization: morality doesn't come from these pages at all. But if not from the Bible, then where? That's the real question. And the answer is far more human than religious leaders want to admit. The bigger picture. Morality outgrows ancient laws. When you add it all up, the so-called divine laws of the Bible tell a very human story, not of eternal wisdom, but of tribal survival. Rules about fabrics, food, farming, and purity weren't handed down by the creator of galaxies. They were written by people trying to keep a small community together in a harsh world. That doesn't make them timeless. It makes them temporary. Cultural codes mistaken for commandments. And when you see them for what they are, the illusion of divine perfection starts to crack. Because real morality doesn't come from banning shrimp or policing women's virginity. It doesn't come from stoning disobedient kids or cutting off hands in brawls. Real morality grows with us. It evolves as we learn more about the world and about each other. Empathy, reason, progress. Those are the things that tell us slavery is wrong, that equality matters, that compassion is stronger than punishment. That's why humanity has outgrown these ancient laws, not because we lost our way, but because we found a better one. And maybe that's the most freeing thought of all. You don't need a rulebook obsessed with fabrics and firewood to live a meaningful, ethical life. You need honesty. You need empathy. You need the courage to question old ideas and replace them with better ones. That's the real story here. Morality is our responsibility. It isn't frozen in stone tablets. It's alive. It's ours to shape, to refine, to carry forward. So the next time someone says the Bible is the foundation of morality, ask them, which laws? The ones about shrimp and beard edges? Or the ones that enslaved people and humiliated women? The cracks are obvious once you start asking. And that's where you and I come in. If you found this video thought-provoking, don't just stop here. Hit subscribe, join the conversation, and share this with someone who still thinks morality begins and ends with ancient laws. Because the more we question, the more we see. Progress doesn't come from clinging to the past. It comes from building a better future.